And what do you think was the right or is the right approach towards Russia? I mean, you might have heard John Mearsheimer and others say that it's the U.S.'s fault and that Russia gave every indication that this was a red line for them involving Ukraine and NATO, and that we should have known. How do we made certain movements with Ukraine that Russia necessarily would attack, and therefore the U.S. is in fact the aggressor? What do you make of that argument?
So John Mearsheimer in particular is a friend. I know him. I have a high regard for
Oh,
his scholarship, and I like him as a person. But I just think he's dead wrong on this. But he's making arguments from fact. So back to our earlier discussion, it's a legitimate debate, right? John Mearsheimer is as fact-based as anyone I know, and so he's looked at the facts and he's come to that interpretation. I see it radically differently from the same facts. Here's how I look at it: that the people of Ukraine have lived under the Russian and German boot for a century. Stalin killed 30 million Ukrainians. Hitler murdered millions of Ukrainians, and many of them Jews, many of them not Jews. And if I were a Ukrainian and we had independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I would definitely want Western American support. And that's a legitimate claim. Why should they not be able to defend themselves? Why don't they have the right to defend themselves as Russians and Germans and others defend themselves? And Putin's response to that is, well, they're not a real people. Well, he doesn't get to make that decision, right? He doesn't get to make that decision. I think they have a right of self-defense, and their desire to be part of NATO made total sense from their point of view. And if NATO is to be an alliance of democracies, and they as a democracy wanted to be part of NATO, it was something we should have considered. I think we could have still managed it better, but I don't think you can blame the United States or blame the Ukrainians for wanting to protect a people and their independence.
is NATO an alliance of democracies, or is it not explicitly an alliance against Russia?
Well, so the quip on NATO in the 1950s when it was created was that it was created for three reasons, right? To keep the Russians out, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Americans in. Russians out, Germans down, Americans in. And to some extent, that's still true. It is an alliance designed to protect what we hope and think are mostly democracies in Europe from Russian aggression. It's designed to protect those democracies from German aggression by making sure that Germany doesn't have a strong, independent military, and to keep the United States in as an economic and military protector. And I think that's reasonable. I think that's realistic, knowing the history of this region. You don't want Germany to have to build a huge military again to defend itself, and you don't want to expose these countries to what is a long history of Russian aggression. I mean, Putin has shown us that Russia will do this. So I think it's a defensive alliance. It's not perfect, but it is a legitimate and generally non-aggressive alliance that protects democracies.
There's the argument that like NATO has this implicit circular reasoning embedded within it, because by creating this alliance, you're therefore making Russia feel defensive and have to be an aggressor to say, wow, there's all these countries that are explicitly against me. And there's this thought that had we invited Russia into NATO, or had we dispelled NATO after the Cold War, that Russia wouldn't have been as aggressive. What do you make of that? The idea that like by setting up this NATO arm, you're creating these two sides.
Yeah, well, there is something to that. I think there's a fact basis to that argument. And there are even some who have said that the United States tricked the Soviet Union, that Gorbachev believed that NATO would not be expanded, at least, and then we did expand NATO. So I think those are legitimate points of view. I also think that if you look at the facts, NATO did many things to reach out to Russia. We created the Partnership for Peace, for example. And NATO's posture before the attack on Ukraine was a posture of much more defense. NATO was not in a position to attack Russia. So yes, Russia can feel left out, and I see that. And you're balancing that with the interests that Poland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, and others have in defending themselves. So there is a trade-off there. But it's not fair to say that NATO threatened Russia. It didn't. Its posture was defensive. And even now, it's not really prepared to attack Russia. in any way. But maybe more could have been done. Yes, I mean, the effort was to make Russia feel like NATO was a friendly alliance, to connect Russia economically. And I think it is a fair criticism to say that in retrospect, we should have done more in those dimensions.
You said you respect John Mearsheimer's view because it's based in fact. Are there any facts that you and John Mearsheimer disagree on?
I think, yes, I think we would disagree in our emphasis on the Ukrainian people being a people who have a right to defend themselves. I think John sees the world in terms of great powers. And in seeing the world in terms of great powers, he thinks that in kind of Thucydides fashion, right? This is what Thucydides says in his great work on the Peloponnesian War, that the big powers do what they must, and the small powers, the small people accept it. They have no choice. He sees the world that way, and there's a fact pattern to that. But I don't see the 20th century that way. I see the 20th century as a century of smaller peoples rising up, former parts of empires and others. And so it's not a disagreement on what the facts are, but it's a disagreement on how much emphasis you give to Ukrainian identity and who the Ukrainians are.
Do you believe that in John Mearsheimer's belief that U.S. and a few other NATO countries lied to Russia and misled Russia historically?
I don't think that's right. Actually,
No.
I would dispute the facts to him a little bit, because I've looked at the policy, as has he, and I think what you've had are shifting policies and uncertainty. So Bill Clinton, when he becomes president, doesn't know what he's going to do about NATO. So he didn't lie to Boris Yeltsin, the then Russian leader. He wasn't sure, right? So what you have is American uncertainty. You might even have Americans changing positions, but that's different from lying. Lying is Vladimir Putin now saying that there are Nazis in Ukraine, or when there is an attack in Russia, a terrorist attack in Russia, that he knows was not caused by Ukraine, blaming the Ukrainians for organizing it. That's lying. What you have with the United States is mixed signals, and you could blame us for giving mixed signals. But I have not seen evidence that any president on that issue explicitly told Russia something that they knew was not true.
Got it. And that's the point that you and John Mearsheimer disagree on. So